Hi folks, you were Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the position of the great or the wealthiest powers, nation states in the world before World War One, and posit ask the question, but posit the theory that Britain was already inevitably heading towards second tier status, and that World War One was a mistake for the British and hastened their decline into second tier status. And now I think they're the fifth or sixth economy in the world, having been unchallenged number one just over 100 years ago, shows how quickly fortunes can change. And and also looking at power and wealth, that the trajectories that are in place are often invisible and hard to discern and see, but and of course it's easy with hindsight to see them, but Britain was already heading towards second tier power status at a rate of knots, say post 1895, and that they're going into World War One was a misreading of the geopolitical structure of the world, and was an outdated vision of their place in the world and indeed their place in Europe. So let me talk a little bit about that. Now, the British did a display at the port of Spithead in southern Britain, where they showed off the British fleet, which was unchallenged and unrivaled at the time as the world's foremost naval power, and the technology was considered to be the leading edge technology in armaments and shipbuilding and so on at the time. And really all the world's military experts and military theorists came along to have a look, and they were in awe of but rather than being overawed by the British power, it simply whetted appetites. The Americans and the the Americans and the Germans in particular came away with a very determined view that they must do whatever they can to rival Britain's power. Now, Britain in the 1890s was the world's wealthiest nation overall in terms of the volume of trade, in terms of pretty much 50% of all the goods that were moved around the world were in British ships. Pretty much all the insurance and finance raising done in the world was done through the insurance firms and financial firms in the City of London. Raw material movement, British manufactured goods still had a pretty big share of the world's industrial output. So it appeared that Britain appeared, rich and almost unassailable as the number one nation. But in mercantile terms, this, of course, was not the case. The trajectory for decline was already in place, and not that there weren't people that didn't see it. There were, but their voices were the voices sort of in the background. The voices at the front saying, "Nah, it's no problem. Everything's fine. What are you talking about? What nonsense? Conspiracy theorists." They were in the forefront. So, but the voices in the background were talking about some serious things. They were, and you can see you can look at the archival archives of the newspapers back in the time. Particularly in the industrial or manufacturing areas, they were probably the first to see it. But they came, these commentators that were sounding warnings were looking at it from a few different points of view. One, they were saying that in the newer technologies, such as in electronics and chemicals and so on, and in the precision engineering, precision metallurgy, that the United States and Germany, particularly Germany, were pulling well ahead of Britain. Britain was falling behind in these newer technologies. Not that they didn't have some sort of presence, they did, but that the Germans were going much further ahead with it and much faster. the second thing was mass. Mass production, the idea of achieving economies of scale through mass production and standardization, even in the 1890s. And by the way, into the First World War, even British factories were still producing so-called precision engineered goods that weren't the same size, down to like micron level measurements. So you had these absurd situations on the battlefield where say one of the howitzers, the big field guns would break down. They just need to move apart from one, so they try and cannibalize a part from another one of the field guns where a different component had broken down, but they couldn't interchange the parts a lot of the time because they weren't sufficiently precision engineered down to micron level to be interchangeable. That means different factories were producing ostensibly the same product to the same plans, the same blueprints and tech drawings and everything, but the components didn't fit, so they couldn't do that interchanging. That was very different on the German side. As an example, the German goods were precision engineered to a much higher standard, and they could do this complete interchange. So field maintenance on the German side was far superior. So you could have a loss of some firing pin or some minor sort of thing could break down on a field gun in the British side, and that was it. The whole gun was inactive. They couldn't change the parts, whereas on the German side they could. So this precision engineering was where the British were falling behind as well. And I've mentioned this previously, but there was an American, I think it was Colt or one of the sidearms or small firearms and manufacturers. The salesman came to Britain trying to sell the guns, and he had 6 guns, and he broke them all to components, put them in the box, jumbled them all up. This is like 1880s or 1890s. Jumbled them all up, and then reassembled 6 pistols from the jumbled up parts, and he was frequently able to, the sales guy was able to hold the British potential buyers or customers in awe as they look at it and go, fuck, you can do that? Because that level of precision engineering and interchangeability was still not really conceived of in Britain. The same goods from the same factory, you could do it too, but not if those products were manufactured in a number of factories. Then that interchangeability was pretty small. Similarly, the British were still producing things on what would be considered small shop type workshops. The idea of the big sort of factory where it could all be made in mass production, it was there. I mean, it was happening, but nowhere near the scale that it was in Germany or United States. So the ability to produce, particularly the newer engineering goods, at a price through the mass production techniques, the British were missing the boat on that in a lot of areas, and so the Germans were stealing a march on that. So with these newer technologies, with these newer manufacturing techniques, and also in the area of metallurgy, the British were already in decline. That trajectory was already there, and given those newer technologies and organizational techniques and so on would play an increasing role in economic efficiency, organizational efficiency, cost of goods produced, quality of goods, quality being very important, quality of goods, and also the latest technology and reliability, things like this. For electronics, for example, in German manufactured firms, the electronics were very reliable compared to the British manufactured goods, as an example. So even back in the day, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So these were all factors that were presaged or indicated British decline, and but it didn't seem so. So as the British decline in manufactured goods became apparent, there was a general increase in things like shipping, insurance, finance, and so on, or what were called trade invisibles. And this tended to mask, at least initially, mask the decline in the real wealth creating industries of manufacturing, new inventions, innovation, newer technologies, and so on. Now, the British elite class chose to invest money in what they saw as easy profits in greenfield type investments. So they would invest money in, North American railways or South American copper mines, or those sorts of things. Now, as their own, the British had a decent sized coal industry, but as the cost of extracting the coal, had to go deeper and deeper underground. The cost of extracting the coal increased. The British didn't switch to different sort of forms of energy or look to sort of any the level of efficiencies that might have been looked at elsewhere. And the Germans had access to much bigger coal reserves, as indeed the Americans did, and that were less expensive to extract. So all of these things in combination were leading to British decline, and also a relative decline, as in the Americans and the Germans were moving forward or ahead at a faster rate. So even though the British weren't declining in an absolute net sense, their rate of growth and their rate of new wealth creation and their penetration of markets with newer technologies, organizational efficiencies, manufacturing efficiencies, and so on, they were there, but at very small increments, whereas the Germans and the Americans were running ahead at much greater increments. The other thing too that was causing British decline is the British stuck doggedly to free trade as a mantra. This had quite a perverse effect, in as much as the Americans and the Germans were protecting their industries with tariffs and quotas. Typically what happens with tariffs and quotas is, when a government imposes them, is that the local industries that are protected by these tariffs and quotas take it as an opportunity, as a free ride. It's a free loading, it's a free ride. Hey, we can sit back, put our feet on the desk and get a big, fat, happy, dumb smile watching those profits roll in, because we ain't got no more competition. We can charge what we want. We can be as efficient as we want. We can produce low quality goods because there's no other option for the customer. So that's one. And often, not always, but often that happens. But what happened in the United States and Germany, perhaps because they had a large local consumer base, as in larger population. Population in Germany is nearly double that of Britain. And the United States sort of double, more than double of the British population. So, starting to push 3 times. So they've got a much bigger domestic base of consumers. So while they're using tariffs to protect their local industries, they're also producing, world-class, top-quality goods, and at a competitive price. So they're really becoming world competitive, but using the tariff wars to generate income for reinvestment and so on, which is the way to do it. If it's very much like a national purpose to it, similar to how the Japanese behaved after the 1870s. They decided to modernize very, very quickly, and they were able to almost completely modernize their economy in 20 years, which is an astonishing feat when you think about it. So this is the situation. This is a situation Britain was in. And now there's talk about, well, their population was greater because they had the empire and this sort of thing. That wasn't didn't quite work out that way. There was a lot of domestic production in the empire as well. So even though Britain could get raw materials coming to the factories in Britain and then sending out the finished goods, the manufactured goods, that proportion of raw materials in manufactured goods out to the world, that was declining quite rapidly, as well as particularly with say in Australia there'd be steelworks and all sorts of things being set up in Australia or elsewhere, Canada and so on, which would reduce the amount of finished or manufactured goods that would be made in Britain and exported. So this is it. So Britain was on a trajectory of decline. Germany and the United States were on an upward trajectory, and a trajectory that was much faster than that of Britain. So Britain's decline was relative rather than absolute. For example, Britain is a richer country today than it was in 1895. but in 1895 it was the #1 richest country in the world, whereas today it's, I think, 6th, even though it's much richer today than it was then, because other economies have moved ahead at a much faster rate. So now Britain has taken a view, probably since I'd say the 1730s. You could even go back a bit earlier than that, but since the 1730s, that they must somehow contribute to a balance of power in Europe, so that no one power would control the European continent, and that they would go to war and put their resources into any effort to prevent one power being completely dominant on the continent, and they would fight those battles for as long as it took. That, to some extent, was a feasible way of looking at things. Prior to that, there was also a connection with balance of power in Europe, insofar as a French provincial duke, King William, or Duke William, and later King William. This is the Battle of Hastings in 1066. He came to England and defeated the Anglo-Saxon army of King Harold, and so this provincial French duke set himself up as the King of England, and he was the Duke of Normandy in France, who themselves were, I think, 5th generation Norwegians or Danes. So the much of France was then owned by the same guy as the King of England, because he was Duke of Normandy plus some other provinces. So there were something like a 500-year civil war between the French Duke and who was doubled up as the English king, French Duke, fighting for his territory because he wanted to keep the French territories. And so this went on 500 years. This spawned people such as Joan of Arc and all this sort of thing. So it was effectively a French civil war that went for 500 years. And in the end, it was worked out that France became a nation, England became a nation, and they didn't bother with each other. But the English were still sort of tied into this idea of achieving a balance of power in Europe. And this figured very much into the thinking of politicians in Britain and the ruling elite for 200 years or so, more than 200 years. There's a second reason that as Britain started to develop as an industrial power, they found that a very, very substantial size of their market was for selling finished goods, was selling them into Europe. And so Europe industrialized, particularly, say, France and Spain, and Italy, all these other places. They industrialized much later. Germany not so much, but they industrialized much later than Britain did. So for quite a long time, Britain had access to a very large European market that was a reasonably well-to-do market in relative world terms. They could sell their finished goods in that. So if they were to lose that, and Napoleon Bonaparte made it very clear that if once he was in control, that he would keep all that market for French producers and French manufacturers. So the British were very sensitive to the idea of any one nation controlling the European thing. So when Germany federated in 1870 and defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War, the British had stood on the sidelines of that war and viewed it with some sort of horror. Now, the British kings and a lot of the British aristocracy were actually of German extraction, because only Britain and Germany were Protestant nations at the time. So there was a lot of intermarriage between them because of that Protestant connection. But the British viewed that with horror. And then when Germany started to obviously and openly challenge British maritime supremacy, then this was it. The British were convinced that Germany had to be stopped, and if there was a war, they would have to get in on the side of any other power prepared to fight the German bid for supremacy. So when the First World War broke out, the British considered it in their interests, economic and financial and geostrategic and so on, to fight against the Germans. The reality, though, was that Germany was, industrially and through a manufacturing and organisational sense, much further advanced than the British ever had imagined. The British hadn't realised how far they'd fallen behind the curve on in manufacturing and industrial goods and in the later technologies and just organisational structure, putting together a large efficient army and this sort of thing. So even though the Germans were outmatched economically by huge amounts and from a population sort of viewpoint, the Germans still were able to fight on for that many years and inflict a much higher ratio of casualties on their enemies than they would receive given resources deployed. So, on a relative basis, say that the German army in World War I was able to, for example, I'll make just round numbers here, kill one enemy for the cost of $1. For the British to kill an enemy, it would cost them $3, that type of thing. So the vast expenditure of resources, so they become quite inefficient on a relative basis. So should they have gone to war in World War I? Well, Germany was, and we see it today. Germany was going to achieve hegemony anyway, not necessarily because of their military prowess. Well, that was one thing, but because they could produce much better quality goods, much higher quality goods at a better price, and could distribute them more effectively, more efficiently, and so on and so on and so on. So from an economic, organizational, engineering, technological point of view, Germany was already on a trajectory to handsomely surpass Britain, and that was going to happen anyway. Going to war wouldn't stop it. Would it slow it down? Maybe, but not by any appreciable amount. I may be going to war at a huge cost of blood and treasure, and only because of the Great Depression came. Maybe it slowed down British decline by 10 years, as in it slowed Germany down, and the Great Depression took the Americans took a big hit from the Great Depression. Britain was less affected by it, but was affected. So it bought Britain maybe 10 years. But going to war achieved nothing. It handed large sections of what would have been the world market, or some sections of it, to the Americans. It took so much British treasure to fight the war that they never anticipated would go for that length of time, by the way. But the idea they could defeat Germany in a matter of weeks is just beyond absurd for any sensible observer at the time, and certainly looking back. So my argument is Britain was already on decline. It was already going to be a second-rate power. Its decline was inevitable and unavoidable without huge, dramatic and convulsive sort of action at home, which in Britain, which just wasn't there to be seen. So I think it was a waste of time to go to war, and it achieved nothing. And the British decline was unavoidable, and German hegemony and American supremacy was equally unavoidable. It was on a very firm trajectory, and particularly in a new age consumer economy where the mass of consumers played quite a vital role in and the distributed wealth through a middle class type economy, which both the Americans and the Germans had, even more so than Britain's one, really. Then that too, those were the signs. But it's easy to be an armchair expert and look back. But there were many voices, not prominent necessarily, but there were many voices at the time that 1910, 1911, that were pointing out that this was British decline was already happening, and unless it was stopped or arrested or reversed, that Britain would sink into the status of being a second-rate power. And they were right. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.